Where do people go wrong with vintage? Is an absolutely fantastic question to have picked out. Might be a few of you that are going, wait, aren't you the guy that it didn't work out with your vintage business? Might be me, but there's a little bit more of a complexity to that anyway, because I didn't make decisions out of whether things were vintage or not. Anyway, hope everyone's all right. Hope whenever you see this, you've been having good Christmas periods and or New Year's. I'm just trying to shoot a few videos back to back off some topics. Hang on. Thought there was, wait. I'm pretty sure there's like 50p in this jacket and it's in the lining. You know what, they'll find it when they wash it. Where do people go wrong with vintage? So this question itself basically implies that there's a right way to go about vintage. And I want to make it clear that whatever path you take, you can probably make it the right path. And even if you've gone wrong, you can go right. So the first place that people go wrong with vintage is understanding what vintage actually is. I probably will drum this one in quite a few times to people, and I hope that it does trigger some of you enough to make a comment and either give me another opinion or give me some feedback to run with it. But the first way that people go wrong with vintage is understanding vintage. Vintage is the age and time of a product. To me personally, I assume vintage as anything before 20 years ago of production and has to have been in circulation for 20 years. That is based on what I ran with my brand and how I facilitated that. Look at that. That's a cool corduroy jacket, isn't it? That's really cool. Giving me like old 90s like kids cartoon vibes. I don't know why. Understanding vintage, right? Understanding how vintage works and how it is separate to this normal second-hand stuff that I'm finding. However, I find vintage in second-hand, but not all second-hand is vintage. So, understanding, create a definition that is accurate but also works for you. So, the underlying thing you have to know is that vintage is the age and time of a product. So if you go, I've got this Topman jacket from 2015, is it vintage? Personally for me, I would say no. I think the reason why 2000 and before works is because 2000 is when the Y2K era came in. And when we're talking about vintage in this respect, I'm talking purely about clothing, not about wine, not about boats, not about anything that has a completely different proportionate relativity to its age as a relation of it being called vintage. So when I'm thinking about clothes, I think about it in the cycle of the clothing era, where pre-2000s was vintage in my eyes, anything over 20 years ago. So someone could say, oh, so you said vintage is 20 years and older, so it could be something from 2003 or 2004. Technically, yes. In our lifetime, of like an average age of 80, it's not an unfair testimonial to say that clothing produced 20 years before you now that has still managed to be in circulation and able to be worn is classed as vintage. So, the understanding is the first point. Once you understand how vintage works, you understand where you have your own, I guess, personal leverage, what you're easier to understand. You might be somebody that really wants to know about the history of a brand. You know, you might want to look at something like, you might go so far down the history of it that you might go, you know what, actually, Levi's was made in the late 1800s, so anything from vintage Levi's is probably going to be like 1960 and earlier. Everything afterwards is just going to be regular Levi's. I know that's a tangent, but you can see how once you understand vintage, whether it's understanding the history of brands and the age and the starting point of them, whether it's understanding maybe what other people in the market call things vintage. Look at Nike sweatshirts on a third-party website and look at all the people that use vintage in the title. What's the kind of garment tag of that sweatshirt? Look at the history of garment tags. Understanding it is complex because the way that you learn will just be the starting point for how you then integrate with everything else. If you start by knowing the history, you'll know the history of so many brands that every time you go to learn about a new brand, you will learn about it. Also, learning the history of a brand helps you understand when they were started. If a brand started in like 2010, it's probably not vintage. But this is for the point that I've got, which I'm trying to remember what the actual point was itself, is like how to, was it understand? I've done so many of these videos now, hang on. You know what? I'm not all over the place, guys. You're all over the place. No, the better way is to like, the question will come to me at the end and I'll see how close I've answered it. But understanding vintage is, I would say, the most important thing with where people go wrong selling vintage. Come back to me just like that. So once you have a better understanding of the actual vintage itself, how you define its era, its age, how you define all that sort of stuff, you can then have a better leverage with how you approach the selling of it. Maybe you understand, based on the years of the tag, something like Reebok, you look at, it has a better success rate from items selling from like 2000 and before, or this new line that Reebok brought out in like 1995 was popular. And you know, because you're working on second-hand items, and also it can't be assumed that everybody that has vintage in the title online already has an understanding of what vintage is. They're just using it because it is still, at this point now, it's still considered a hot word. That's why I like to use second-hand, because whether you want to prettify things and call it like pre-loved or like not used but still loved or anything like that, that's fine. But realistically, if I tell you it's second-hand, on the get-go, you know that this is not new straight away. So I make it very clear that my establishing point is to let you know exactly what it is straight away. And I think that with vintage, the understanding of it is important, because if you don't have that, then you probably might lack the confidence to be able to sell it in certain ways. I don't know, I just think that the understanding of things is such a major influence on how you will have success actually selling vintage. So the understanding of vintage in order to help sell vintage. But where else people go wrong, it probably just sits under the same line as the understanding. I would say the understanding and the education is the most important point. Another example, what happens is you get people, what's this leg doing? Don't know. You also get people that will incorrectly price products because they don't actually know what it's worth. Their intel of how they've based the prices on it haven't worked out to make sense. So somebody might be like, oh, I get these rare Adidas equipment sweatshirts, they're £150, when the market at its peak might have sold them at like 95. A lot of people will just fast track, see the brand and then whack a price on it. But I think that where people go wrong with vintage is that they don't take the time to understand what they're selling. They don't take the time to understand and educate themselves on how things have a certain value, how garment tags, ages and history can have big reflective differences on that price point online. And not only that, but an item is worth as much as somebody's willing to pay for it. However, a business model can't be built off of hopeful selling, where maybe you just take the price up by 20% on everything just because you think it's got a better value. Again, actually, that's hard, because if you have a real good investment on your aesthetic and the way that you look, you can leverage your prices. I really should just stick to one point at a time. It's very, very hard to not, because you just like, so many thoughts when you go off. But understand and educate yourself on vintage, and by doing that, you surpass a lot of other people in the industry that don't want to have the time to do that. That there is not a return on investment heavy in the short term, but the long term just basically means that the more you invest in time to understand the Lyland Scots, the Adidas, you understand exactly where this brand started, where it was made, like who started it, anything interesting about the brand, what's given it its value over time, to help you understand where its value might go over time still within the second-hand economy and vintage. So I hope this point has found you well. My legs somehow got up there again. Yeah, I hope this one's found you well. I think I missed the point a little bit and lost direction, but hopefully this has found you well. And if you are selling vintage, then hopefully you are already opening another tab, reading stuff. So big up to you lot.